Why don't you put your laptop here so I can change them?
I think they have a cord running all the way there. So
I see, I see.
yeah, but just pause or signal and go to the next one. Just yell at me for the next one.
Something and
Yeah, you can just do like next.
okay.
Yeah, next. Oh, that's
Oh really?
I'll bring it in.
Okay.
Mic test. Okay, perfect. Hi, folks. We're going to start soon, so please take a seat when you can. I just wanted to orient you to the space. The bathroom is all the way over the back on the left-hand side if you need. I'm so sorry it's so hot today. There's a lot of water in the fridge as well as a freezer over there. Just maybe you can wave your hand and I will grab some for you and can deliver to your seat. So. All right, we're going to try this again. I think it's fixed. So we're going to start soon. And I wanted to introduce our space as well as the free clinic and also our professor over here, Iman Dadras. So you can take a seat. So welcome to, I think a lot of you are already familiar with the space, but we are all Power Books. And my name is T, and we're all volunteers. We're all volunteer 100% run space. And I'm part of the free clinic at All Power Books. So the free clinic started in 2021, and we operate in alongside the distro that happens on Saturdays with food giveaway. We have a physical location here that pops up every other Saturday. We also are medics, also go out to different encampments. So we have different locations where they set up and provide services to encampments and community members. And we have also rolled out the care team function underneath the All Power Free Clinic, which is providing social services and mental health, and also building out alternative forms of care under mental health without calling it that, because as we all know, mental health practices have been, and also social workers have been participating in a lot of carceral practices and systems of harm. So we're hoping to build out a new model where we can, while the current one underneath the colonial forces are collapsing, as we see. So I wanted to introduce to you all Professor Iman Dadras, who I got to meet through my coworker, Kyung-in, who will be facilitating the discussion and also will be moderating the slides at the back. Kyung-in is my colleague and also fellow therapist at KFAM, which is a Korean American Family Services that's located in K-Town. So when I wanted to start out, so Professor Iman is, he's an associate professor at Alliant University, and he is also a licensed mental health therapist, but also his focus and research have been on immigrant population and acculturation stressors on our immigrant folks. And he also has been focusing on the epistemology of the critique of the self in terms of the therapist. And when I first met Professor Iman, there's a funny little anecdote that happened. So we were chatting on Zoom, kind of planning this out. I was inviting him to check out the space and kind of plug into our healthcare political education, which we feel like it's lacking a lot in LA. And he so graciously just said that, T, I'm just happy to come to the bookstore and just mop your floor. And I'm like, that is so generous of you in so many ways. And I think that was something that really touched me in many ways. Like, how is someone so humble? And that really made a lot of impact on my end. But anyway, so I'm going to pass the mic over to you for the lecture portion. So after the lecture, we will have a quick Q&A, and we will also transition to the discussion topics.
Thank you, T. Thank you, T. Can you hear me okay? Very good. I am immensely excited and happy to be in this space. Relatively speaking, I guess I had my share of participating in academia, had few stage at national, international conference, but I can assure you that I have never been so thrilled and excited and feel at home and not being bullied and dominated by rigid structure of academic discourse in America. Now, what today I hope I'm able to convey is looking at the various structure of psychotherapy in 21st century from a critical theory lens perspective, precisely an approach that I borrow and concept that I borrow from Herbert Marcuse. I understand, relatively speaking, in America, within the field of mental health, relatively here and there, people are familiar with work of Herbert Marcuse, Eric Fromm, I'm sorry, but less familiarity with the work of Herbert Marcuse because he was not really that much concerned with the issues of individual and psychotherapy. However, he made few critical reference to the problem of psychotherapy. My first encounter with Marcuse happens around 22 years ago when I was in Iran, and my mentor, Professor Hassan Ashairi, he gave me a copy of One Dimensional Man. So by that time, I was already familiar with Eric Fromm. I loved Eric Fromm, and indeed, sometime in my classroom, I tell my student that Eric Fromm was my first intellectual crush. But at that time, the book was difficult for me, was overwhelming. Still, the book is difficult. Nonetheless, it was a very interesting intellectual encounter. So my mentor, Professor Ashairi, he actually had spent 3 days with Herbert Marcuse in a conference in Germany when he was a student. So that was my first encounter with Marcuse. So throughout my teaching, I try to bring critical theory conversation to my classroom, more emphasize on Eric Fromm and his kind of areas of work around sane society, art of loving, which actually was part of my textbook that I assigned in couple therapy class, and later on I got in trouble at university. I guess still there is a history of Marxism and Freudianism in America. Now, here I would like to start with the idea and their move with why critical theory branch of Frankfurt School, or precisely Freudo-Marxism, is important. The conversation starts around the 18th century. Spinoza says, why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as if they are fighting for their salvation? Fast forward 200 years later, the famous disciple of Freud, Wilhelm Reich, wrote a seminal article in 1929 called Historical Materialism and Psychoanalysis. And there he writes, what must be explained is not the fact that who is hungry steals, or the fact the man who's exploited strike, but why majority of those who are hungry don't steal, and why majority of those who are exploited do not strike. Precisely that was a moment that one can claim the birth of Freudo-Marxism as a tradition of thinking, precisely what Marxist theory could not explain. The failed communist revolution of after First World War, and why instead of imagining of communist kind of emergence, what we saw actually was fascism in majority of the countries. And that's where a lot of group of scholars realize possibly psychoanalysis can help us to understand what happens to working class, that they willfully participate in their own subjugation. So throughout this conversation, I try to kind of somehow emphasize that this is also the case, and Marxism alone cannot explain the exploitation of majority of people in isolation. The question is not that why the system has a desire to exploit us, but rather than why we desire to be exploited. What happens to the unconscious subject that desire this form of exploitation? So in that sense, again, I'm not trying to spend so much time to further explain Freudo-Marxism, but I guess it's very foundational to the rest of conversation. Only holding in mind that if for Marx, the subject is historically exploited and oppressed by the class oppression, for Freud, subject is historically oppressed due to the force of civilization. That's what precisely Freud emphasized, that unhappiness, that neuroticism, it's a price that we pay for progressiveness of civilization. Now, I guess, actually I don't see what is behind me. Maybe from there I can kind of match what I have behind me. So a little bit of history about Marcuse. Marcuse was born in Berlin. So during the time, his father was a quite prosperous merchant, and they were quite well off. During that time, Marcuse reports that the Jewish community was quite well assimilated in Germany. There was no experience of anti-Semitism that Marcuse talks about. So in around in 1922, please if it's wrong, somebody correct it. Around 1922, he gets his PhD doctorate in German literature and philosophy. He's about 24 years old at that time. So then, interestingly enough, he goes and works in a bookstore for a few years in Berlin. And then in 1928, he comes back to University of Freiburg and does another dissertation under supervision of Martin Heidegger. Heidegger became one of the most important kind of influential figure of that time. Actually, what Marcuse discussed is a form of Marxist existentialism. However, after the notorious Heidegger support of Nazi Germany, so they separated, they ended the relationship. It was not only Marcuse, some of you possibly have seen or read. Hannah Arendt also was another distinguished student of Heidegger who ended the relationship, but there was a little bit of romantic twist there. Hannah Arendt was romantically involved with Heidegger. There are a series of exchange of letters that are very, very interesting. Now, because of the situation of Germany, the Frankfurt School, they all immigrated to United States around May 1933. So they begin to develop or continue the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory in America. Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse. At that time, there was still a good relationship between them, especially between Erich Fromm and the rest of the group. They participate in a project that's called Authoritarian Personality. Part of the work was done by Erich Fromm, but they had a different attitude, an argument which in one of the slides, I'm going to briefly touch on it. I guess it's make more sense. You know, I'm a little bit neurotic. Even this is what I do in my classroom. I get up and walk around. It was very interesting. The debate become really, really heated. It was published in a journal called Dissent, the back and forth between Marcuse and Fromm. Fromm claimed that Marcuse do not understand psychoanalysis, and he is very pessimist. Marcuse called him that you are very naive and conformist. Actually, in the book that I'm going to talk about later, in the last chapter of Eros and Civilization, actually Marcuse critiqued the new Freudianism, basically Adler, Erich Fromm, Erik Erikson, and they says what they are trying to do, they are de-revolutionizing Freudian theory, and basically through this talk therapy, they are making sure that the subject become adjusted to the maladjusted system. Can we? Yes, there are certain keywords of Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse. Still, my unconscious is talking about Erich Fromm. Reason and Revolution, which at least for me is a very difficult book. That's where he examined Hegelian dialectics and Marx. So today I basically would emphasize few ideas from Eros and Civilization and One-Dimensional Man. Then later he wrote an essay on liberation talking about the power of art and how it can negate the domination in society. Counter-revolution and revolt is more extension of reason and revolution and the aesthetic of dimension. But like I said, I borrow few concepts from these two books. Now maybe this is also worthy of recognition. I have a good amount of my former and current students here. Actually, part of this conversation we actually wrote a paper that is still unpublished, but we presented the paper at 2019 at Herbert Marcuse International Society conference at University of Santa Barbara. Actually, currently my colleague, Dr. Artiaga, went and did the presentation alone. I was not able to go. My other colleague, Dr. Espinoza, couldn't also go. So this has been a long project. Now, in Eros and Civilization, a philosophical inquiry into Freud, very interesting. This is a time, for the first time, Marcuse began to really synthesize Freud and Marx. He basically starts with Freud, and he says that usually majority of reading of the Freudian theory remain very conservative. Actually, there are so much radical potential if one look at Freud properly. However, at the same time, he make a critique of Freudian reality principle. Now, again, I'm not necessarily the best person to do a Freudian lecture, but please bear with my limited understanding of theory. Now, Freud says at the beginning, the subject develop the pleasure principle, guide the subject through these areas of this immediate gratification. The best example, precisely in America, would be credit card. What is credit card? Credit card is precisely responding to one's own immediate gratification. You can not only you can desire something, but you can not only desire, but you can have something that you should not have or do not have a reason to have in an immediate moment, right? So the subject, the child, children are driven by pleasure principle. However, through this form of development of ego, the subject realizes, no, whatever I desire or want, society is not going to give it to me. There are restrictions. There are desires that society does not let me to act upon. That's where reality principle emerge, which actually we also develop the so-called superego, right? We follow certain social conduct in group, in society. We understand ethics, borders of conversation, understanding the other's right. Not that we always understand, but in general, how reality principle function. Now, Reality principle also says men must be, or human being desire must be always repressed in order for civilization to progress, to function, for society to become harmonious. And also Freud used the concept of ananke to emphasize there is a scarcity in society. We have to work, we have to produce. Now, Marcuse here make an objection, says Freudian reality principle was a historical necessity due to technological advancement and abandonment of resource. Today, we do not need to engage in alienated and unnecessarily work. So on top of that, then Marcuse brings Marx to the picture and says, precisely that's the area that Marx's theory could not predict in terms of if the working class become truly an instrumental tools of revolution. What happened that working class almost globally become co-opted, become a member or become complicit in their own oppression. So few concepts. Also he emphasized there are more concepts. Again, I try to do justice to some of them. He also discussed the surplus repression. He says the current reality principle of advanced industrial society creates surplus repression. Because now, imagine the amount of work that people are doing. There are abundance of form of work, labor, that is not really justified. It's totally useless. That's why you look at the workers' report. In general, American workers are unhappy and unsatisfied because the subject knows that the work is immensely obscene and meaningless. And again, if you are living in a state such as California, understanding the living expenses almost make life immensely, unimaginably unbearable. Now, he also used performance principle, which is a name that Marcuse used for Freudian reality principle. He says if we historicize Freudian reality principle, it should not be there. But the way we approach work, we approach productivity today, for Marcuse is some phenomena that he calls performance principle. I'm going to provide one more kind of additional explanation in some of concept. He also, in the book, discussed about eros, and eros having a capacity for change, for revolution, for resisting domination and power. Now, these are the same concept that I try to talk about if you think about non-repressive society. So the idea that Marcuse talks advocate for a society where human instincts are liberated and reducing unnecessarily repression. Now, you possibly have heard that joke by Slavoj Žižek that you don't hate Mondays, you hate capitalism. Now, but when we look at it, why is that so? Through all this, I have been in US for past 15 years. I have never seen, ever, anybody tells me, tomorrow is Monday, I'm very excited. Right? But why is that so? What is the difference between Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? These are just names. But why is that so? A signifier can produce certain form of emotional response into us. That means that the subject unconsciously connects with certain structure. No wonder why people anxiety is so high on Monday. Heart attacks, strokes happen more apparently on Monday. We talk about surplus repression, a critique of excessive social control beyond necessary repression of civilization that limit human subjectivity, right? Isn't that interesting? One thing that I'm from north of Iran. North of Iran look like Washington State. It's green, it's rainy, it looks like Portland. But what I've noticed when I came to America, people have this form of morbid desire to go to nature. Why you always want to escape? Then if there is escape is important, then why we build all of this high-rise building? right? Which I'm going to talk or cover it in technological rationality, that we almost build a society that we cannot tolerate, right? So, and also Eros as a Freudian life instinct, that steel can be cherished, it can be discussed, it can be engaged. And to what extent our daily life is more dominated by death instinct, thanatos, the work that we do that we do not find any kind of meaning or merit into it, rather than I need to keep my work because I have to survive. Now, one-dimensional man is most significant work of Herbert Marcuse. Now, if we only imagine if we are in 60s, almost everybody, not everybody, but majority of people have read the book. Now, when we talk about 60s, the time I'm talking about, it's very uncommon. Herbert Marcuse picture is everywhere. He is everywhere. Everybody knows him. At the time, he is the guru of the New Left, right? A student movement of 60s, at the highest, at 60 age, are worshipping and praising him. His sentence and words are everywhere, even though Marcuse says, I didn't do anything. I only formulated what they were experiencing. Otherwise, I don't want to take any accountability. Now, one-dimensional man, just out of curiosity, may I see how many hands how many people have read the text? Okay. So again, for those of you, in the field of mental health, I seriously encourage you to take a look. But also, I think it's a fantastic read, and it's unimaginable that how still majority of the concepts are relevant. So as you see, he called it studies in the ideology of advanced industrial society. So, and then he's adopting a Freudo-Marxist framework to understand ideology. It's not ideology in that a specific Marxist sense as a form of false consciousness, but for Marcuse it become a form of necessarily false consciousness that people identify and adapt with it. So he talks about one-dimensional thinking, which is quite important, and I would discuss to say how psychotherapy today is suffering from this one-dimensional thinking, only one method or approach to do psychotherapy. Again, especially celebration of certain modality, predominantly evidence-based model that has become so commercialized, commodified, and advertised, while they can have significant, serious ideological consequences, ironically, for both individual and society. He talks about technological rationality, false need, repressive desublimation, which is very important part of our paper, and I'm going to talk about it, and cooptation of opposition. In one-dimensional society, basically what Marcuse is talking about is precisely the precise experience that we have. A society that almost become comfortable in a linear way of thinking. There are areas that society does not open a space for alternative conversation. Doesn't matter what it is. If I ask what is success in America, majority, maybe not in this space, but in majority of a space, I get a very clear definition. Why is that so that suddenly, even on a romantic relationship, on dating side, this is what the student report to me, I'm not on any dating site, that people get matched to each other based on their credit score. How that happen? What one's credit score has to do with the romantic desire? We know what's going on there, but how that happen? What kind of society does that? So in one-dimensional societies, a society that the subject way of living become immensely narrowed in a specific form. The way even we think about other areas, science. Scientificism. If everything is scientific, then it's good. But also, it should be westernized form of science, not a Middle Eastern science, not from Iran that I'm coming from, because I belong to the uncivilized part of the world, right? Which, of course, objectively is quite wrong. Somebody can tell that to Donald Trump. Now, there are many examples that we can discuss that what it means to live in one-dimensional society, right? Think about a radio. Think about a radio who only can receive FM wave. I don't know what are the other station, but I only know FM, right? Possibly my radio was one-dimensional. But that's the subject who can only think in a specific form, totally linear, reductionistic, lack capacity for any form of paradoxical thinking, imagining other form of living, that 8 to 5 days a week, 40 hours a day, fornicating in certain age, producing in certain age, maintaining credit score in certain form, keeping the backyard grass green in certain form, is only way to live, right? Now, technological rationality needs further kind of exploration. It's very interesting. Actually, Marcuse starts with Kant. He's not against rationality. He says it's a good asset, it's a part of the tradition of Western civilization. In what is enlightenment, Kant asked or proposed this idea, dare to use your own reason. One does not need to listen to the Pope, to the church, to the state, to the sovereign power, to the king, to monarch, to think for themselves. However, dialectically speaking, Marcuse argued the same form of rational thinking, since it become an end to itself, not a mean for human prosperity, create trouble for us. The best example possibly would be nuclear bomb, right? This is the case that Adorno and Horkheimer, who are the colleague of Marcuse, discuss in Dialectic of Enlightenment, right? That if you look at the process of nuclear bomb or the technology, is a very sophisticated, evidence-based, scientific, right, process. Majority of us possibly would know nothing about it, correct? But at the same time, the same form of rationality produce irrational result. The world cannot return to its pre-atomic bomb history. It's impossible. Any time, any moment, human race is at the disposal of extinction. It can happen easily. For a majority of time, American, because they are geographically isolated, they are monolinguistic, right? And culturally kind of imperialist, only us. There is a sense of American exceptionalism. That, again, no offense. But that global consciousness, basically, I barely see in Americans. It's very limited. They don't care. I mean, just, there is always this delusion that we are kind of different. We are special. We are immune. But that's absolutely is a wrong fallacy. You know, if you think about it, if you ask your parents, your grandparents, they would tell you what kind of paranoid, schizophrenic atmosphere was present in America during Cold War. Oh, Cuba is going to bomb us. Russia is going to bomb us, right? So that technological rationality and its irrationality, actually, Adorno called it the stupidity of cleverness. The stupidity of cleverness, which we are dealing with it now in the area of AI therapy as well. Somebody, I guess Chomsky, wrote a small paper on something related to a stupidity of ChatGPT. Right? Now we have a crisis. I just saw a recent article that a subject experienced ChatGPT-induced psychosis. Right? So false need is immensely interesting. concept that he talks about. He says a capitalist society create a form of false needs, a unending desire for overconsumption. We just get things that we don't even need. There is a society of wastefulness. And this existential emptiness of alienation suddenly has been bombarded or been replaced by overconsumption. So Marcuse argues that this desire for false needs are creating additional form of or new form of social control and false consciousness, right? Suddenly the subject as a human being to cultivate creativity, a sense of genuine happiness, community, right? Living within atomistic, isolated society, they need to replace this existential void through overconsumption. Repressive disablation is by far the most difficult concept in the book, has been discussed by a lot of other people. Many other scholars have used it. So there are two components. Let me start with sublimation. For some of you are familiar with a tradition of psychoanalysis, sublimation is a form of ego defense mechanism where the subject somehow transfer or transform a socially undesirable urge into some form of socially acceptable exercise. Let's say, again, the famous Freud client that the child who enjoyed mutilating animal or animal tails, the lizard tails, somehow the discussion that you can, if you would like to do that, the society would not like you, would be punished, it's cruel. How about this? You use it for something good and become a surgeon. That you still are cutting gratifying desire, but for something that is socially acceptable and benefitable to others. Now, by repression, that is a common sense for all of you. A subject cannot tolerate certain form of difficult emotions, the unconscious need to repress in order for subject to do not lose reality. This is what we do on a daily basis. We all carry certain unbearable traumas, emotions, difficulty, right? But when we get up every day, if we think about it, we cannot even get out of the house, right? That's how unconscious repression helps us to maintain certain form of functionality within our reality. Now, what Marcuse is arguing, the repressive disublimation, is that instead of truly and genuinely providing a situation that subject can address their own desire and needs for liberty, for happiness, for freedom, for genuine collaboration with others, for having a sense of community, the subject needs and desire become substituted with Kim Kardashian family story, right? Or other form of social activities, right? When you look at, I mean, I'm not dismissing the entire of pop music, but when you look at majority of culture, I can talk about, let's say, the status of pop music in Iran. So I don't want to offend my American audience. What is it? It's basically moves around sexuality, and my heart is broken. And then to what extent one is always perpetually sexually unhappy, and to what extent one is perpetually over heartbroken. Both of them are valid concern for a subject, but is it entirely the existence of subject? And the notion of sexuality become even more interesting. I had the chance to see few countries, and I had few connections across the world. I think based on my observation and understanding, I have never seen any society so hypersexualized. That American society is so hypersexualized that is perpetually distracted by only talking about it, taking it to dress codes, to other areas, but not really the act of sexuality itself. This is basically the critique of Deleuze and Guattari. He says, as far as we begin to talk about it and bring sexuality everywhere, almost sexuality itself lost its meaning. So repressive desublimation happens through various form of mechanism. It aims to hinder the subject or contain subject to some form of conformism. For Marcuse, it says the end result is a form of happy consciousness. Fun, the idea of fun, entertainment. It's very interesting. I've seen it in serious conversation, supposedly, that still the idea is we are going to talk about race and racism. That's something that here and there I do. There is some facilitator, somebody, let's just start with something fun. I said, why do you guys need to be entertained while we are talking about racism or sexism or gender oppression, right? There, Marcuse also talked about the role of language, right? How language shaped the consciousness of population. He actually critiqued the empiricist language that is so limited in terms of its reflection, right? It was very interesting, you know. Again, it depends where part of the world you belong. I am part of some specific part of the world that usually a group of people who look like me, you are usually on the news, right? Iran, this axis of evil, as the first time George Bush called to the recent war with Israel and America during the summer, right? So it becomes very interesting when the language is used in neoliberal academia. In this critical time, in this tumultuous time, in this sensitive time, when they're going to talk about war, racism, right? Mass deportation, live fascism under capitalism on the street, right? To catch, to arrest, to dehumanize subject on a street, on the land of freedom, right? So for Marcuse, that language is basically depoliticizing. The language itself is dumbfounding. Now again, I hope that I can take all of this to discourse of psychotherapy. You can see that language even within the realm of psychotherapy. Sometimes I have had in the past clients call says, you know, well, I'm looking for this, looking for that, I'm shopping for therapy, for therapist. Sometimes if I'm not in a good mood, I say, well, I'm not selling today. What are you looking for, right? It's out of stock. You want CBT possibly, out of stock. DBT, out of stock. IFS, out of stock. EMDR, out of stock. Not today, right? So that way of thinking remain quite fundamental for Marcuse. Now, another, are we good? Okay, so one thing that I don't want to deprive you from, which possibly neither my broken language nor my accent can catch, is very unique style of Marcuse. I remember one of my students wrote one-dimensional, and she said, I got the concept. I said, I know you got it. You are intelligent. You get it. But I said, how, did you remember the first sentence of the book? She said, oh, I didn't read the first sentence. I read some review. I said, no. I understand that you were trying to get a summary and everything, which is good. You got the idea. But there is something that you are missing. And precisely, that's the very interesting linguistic capacity that Marcuse has. On chapter 1, the new form of control, just few sentences, which I think is the explanation of one-dimensional society. A comfortable, a smooth, reasonable, democratic unfreedom prevails in advanced industrial condition, a token of technological progress indeed. So he talks about a form of a democratic unfreedom. Unfreedom is not an absence of freedom, but precisely the lack of capacity of the subject to experience that he or she or they have a choice to act differently. Now, again, I don't want to kind of necessarily bother you with all the simple quotes, but I think some of them are worthy of exploration. especially the second one, when Marcuse, in previous slide, I guess I didn't talk about, the co-optation. One of the most miraculous characteristics of capitalism for Marcuse is precisely this role of ideology, how capitalism was able, or in advanced industrial society, was able to engage people, invite people to come and participate willfully, with enjoyment and with desire in their own subjugation. And what he realized, that capitalism has unimaginable form of plasticity. It can co-opt anything. It can commodify its own enemy. Now, this is where I can a little bit talk about on the notion of this social justice movement, wokeism, DEI, all of them. A few years ago, I wrote a book chapter and borrowed some ideas from other scholars, such as Sarah Ahmed and Slavoj Žižek, that why multiculturalism is a form of racism. Diversity is basically a fascist word. It means nothing. Diversity of what, right? So today, academia perpetually is obsessed with linguistic game of capitalist subjectivity. Oh, I get it. No, I understand your point. But, at the end of the day, I'm going to go back home and I'm trying to maintain the class position that I have. But everything become matter of political correctness, how we follow certain code and modes of language, right? Almost social justice become immensely absurd and meaningless. I know people that, they have a good track history of being racist, misogynist, whatever, but today is trendy and chic. Even that old professor suddenly, last time I saw him in a conference, he said, I am for justice. I said, wow, maybe revolution has happened in America, but only has not been televised, right? How that happened. So Marcuse pay attention to all of this stuff. Again, of course, he died before seeing the rise of neoliberalism. He didn't see how 80s and 90s look like, but he still made that form of critique about America in 40-50, which is considered the golden age of capitalism. Free election of masters does not abolish the masters or the slave. Free choice among a wide variety of goods and services does not signify freedom if these goods and services sustain social control over life of toil and fear, that is, if they sustain alienation. So again, this was just there to a little bit capture your kind of interest. Now, there are three areas that Marcuse directly address psychotherapy. I think from here, I'm going to talk more on the areas of psychotherapy. In the introduction, in the prelogue of Eros and Civilization, he writes, psychological problem indeed become political problem. Private disorders reflect more directly than before the disorder of the whole, and the cure of personal disorder depends more directly than before on the cure of the general disorder. He continues on chapter 5. This is a critique. The second bullet point is a critique of Freudian revisionism. There he says, on the therapeutic ground, such denial may be perfectly justified. But that denial, he's referring that therapist is not trying to act at societal level, right? Not doing sociological analysis, but staying attuned to the problem of client or family or couple at the present. But he continues, however, on therapeutic argument, no therapeutic argument should hamper the development of theoretical construction, which aims not at curing individual sickness, but diagnosing the general disorder, the social sickness of capitalism, right? That's where Marcuse disputes the kind of the so-called functionality of highly individualistic oriented psychotherapy as a form of, any meaningful form of kind of intervention within the social system. Also, he lamented that how therapy apparently is becoming more subservient to a status quo rather than really helping individual, which later on I hope I'm able to discuss, that how current modality of psychotherapy precisely endorse neoliberal ideology, right? Individual must take responsibility for their sadness, depression, anxiety, and totally depoliticize and desocialize the social structure. That's basically would be my main argument. Now, if we look at it from Marcusean perspective, there are certain areas that we can kind of borrow from him to look at the state of psychotherapy. Psychotherapy cannot cure the social sickness of capitalism. Psychotherapy as an ideological apparatus that mystify existential alienation doesn't have a linguistic for it. Now, I want to kind of also a little bit emphasize on this. I am not talking about a very tiny minority of therapists across the world and in America who somehow remain attuned to their work. They know what they are doing. They do not depoliticize or desocialize or deculturalize their clients. I'm talking about psychotherapy as an industry, as a platform, as a managerial class phenomena, right? Not as a few radical therapists here and there. That's not the aim. So psychotherapy can be also viewed as a regime of depoliticization and desocialization. When you look at the current modality, right? Precisely CBT, DBT. Again, this is not about that there is no value in those modalities, but the social, political, cultural, even personal consequences of those modalities. That what happens to the subject? Suddenly the entire problem of the disorder, the diagnosis, falls upon the shoulder of the subject. And the whole structure remains intact because we have unimaginable historical evidence, anthropological evidence that there is no form of universality behind the so-called human being pathology, mental health pathology, right? Anthropologists have done, my apologies, anthropologists have done unimaginable studies in different parts of the world. In New Guinea, there is no one single cases of so-called PTSD. Sometimes I make this joke. Maybe it's not appropriate. I don't know. A student cannot sometimes complain, I guess. I mean, some group of students complain. Those who are very privileged and belong to a specific category of geography. That I think the only one who's not traumatized here is just my grandmother, and she's dead. Why everybody is so obsessed with the discourse of trauma? Why human subject experience becomes so problematized, as Foucault says, that one cannot tolerate not having a diagnosis. I had a supervisee who was working with 16 years old girl. The girl was obsessed. Would you give me diagnosis of borderline personality disorder? Every week she was obsessed. And of course, the supervisee was a little bit kind of upset. I don't know, this is unethical. She would engage in a cognitive conversation trying to convince this 16 years old that this is not good. But the idea for her was that I said, go ask her, what is that she desires? Let's say you have the diagnosis. What would happen? How does that change your life? So psychotherapy as a regime of pacification, that this is what Marcuse talks about, the pacification of existence, that how the notion of entertainment industry, the whole notion of comfort and desire is totally kind of creating a scenario that the subject has no capacity to question, right? That the trouble is that the highly exploited subject doing meaningless work come back home, was able to get a good deal at Best Buy on certain days, big TV, develop this illusion that I'm watching the same thing, or I'm having the same iPhone, I don't know, what is it, 16, 17, 18 as my boss, and I'm driving possibly a good car, and things are good. Where else I can find this, right? So psychotherapy privatized and individualized mental health. That's a serious critique. For past few years, there has been some common receptivity toward this, that some research has been done, still with kind of conservative language, but some people are addressing this issue. Also, how psychotherapy can produce also one-dimensional way of thinking. What if psychotherapists themselves are depoliticized, desocialized, right? That we have an entire of conversation on the self of therapist as a form of important element of training. Now I would like to show that there are certain scholars in the field who have discussed this issue. It's not just an isolated idea, but a still marginalized idea. So in a very interesting quote, Sachin, who is a part of the Milan family therapy group, she says, can anyone do effective therapy without becoming an instrument of social control, without participating and contributing, often unknowingly, to the construction or of the maintenance of dominant discourse of oppression? This is an entirely important and critical question for therapists. You know, what we are seeing today a lot, again, this is where I can talk a little bit as an educator, that I see that a lot. I see a majority of the challenge has nothing to do with what client brings, but then rather therapist lack of ability. When therapist is one-dimensional thinker, only says, okay, there is a diagnosis, there is 8 weeks of treatment, and this is what you get, and things changes, your symptom reduce, your cure, it's done, right? But rather than, I mean, there are modality of psychotherapy, all of them are not same, you know. Let's say within the field of family therapy, one can talk about, let's say, narrative therapy, not that to idealize it, but for integrating Foucauldian discourse analysis in narrative therapy, the therapist use this idea that the problems are the problem. The person is not the problem. So the therapist try to help the client to separate them from the problem, to do not develop a kind of problem-saturated narrative about their existence. So Philip Cushman, that I love him so much, he just died a few years ago in a tragic accident. Great scholar. He wrote few fascinating books. One fascinating seminal article called The Empty Self. Fascinating article. But also, this is the book from the book Constructing Self, Constructing America. Very interesting work. There also, I'm not trying to kind of bother you by reading the entire of quote. You can see it. But he's emphasizing what would happen when therapy or psychology aim to kind of depoliticize, separate the psyche from society. If mental health is a universal phenomenon, why is not the same in India? Why is not the same in Iran? Right? Well, in Iran is not good necessarily, but in Iran you have to think about it for past 46 years that Islamofascist regime is doing certain things to people. Political oppression, sexual repression has a consequence, right? No, it's not just human beings go crazy in isolation, as R.D. Laing says. We need somebody to drive us crazy, certain structure to drive us crazy, right? And again, I didn't want to, I thought hopefully it's given. I could do a long lecture for hours full of empirical evidence from multiple disciplines to show that how neoliberal capitalism by structure is pathogenic. Recently, again, you can look at it from different perspectives. A few years ago, one of my favorite philosophers, Byung-Chul Han, wrote an interesting book, multiple interesting. One of them is called The Burnout Society. In Burnout Society, he talks about how neoliberal society become achievement society. And in this achievement society, if you fail, is your deficiency. You are lazy. You are unmotivated. You are suffering from psychological deficiency. You are not resilient enough. Right? Today you have seen how the conversation around resiliency goes around. Obscene and meaningless. Very problematic. New form of pathologization. Right? Some people have it and some people don't have it. Right? So I think we can go, yes. In a very interesting book, again, if you have not seen it, take a look, Psychiatric Hegemony, a Marxist theory toward mental illness. Again, the same argument. Cohen in that book says psy-professional. All of these helping professionals, psychiatrists, family therapists, counselor, right? What they do, their function is to normalize the fundamental inequalities in capitalist society as natural and as common sense, right? That this is a normal life order. Some people have it, some people don't have it, some people are healthy, some people are crazy. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You can look at public health studies. Public health studies. A study shows one important conclusion in America. The poorer you are, the sicker you are, physically and mentally. Doesn't matter. Right? From physical issues, blood pressure, kidney failures, hyperventilation, too much stuff, right? Is very well documented, almost impossible. I mean, I don't think any kind of right-wing subject with common sense even bother to make that argument. Almost impossible. Can we move on? Yes. Well, this is a long quote in advance. This is another important quote I think is very powerful by the late Mark Fisher on his important seminal book, Capitalism, Realism, Is There Any Alternative? So basically the same idea that this, today again, it's very, I mean, it's just sometimes to me looks like a comedy that today suddenly we have brain wellness center. Right? Suddenly depression, again, is a problem of your dopamine, your serotonin, your neurochemical imbalances. Actually, Nicholas Rose, who is a Foucauldian scholar, wrote a book called Our Psychiatric Future, that he talks about how this suddenly the neurological discourse or neurochemical discourse become a trendy, fashionable conversation. And you know, one of the characteristics of capitalism is a neophilic culture. It loves new things because it's perpetually bored, right? There is some form of desire, partially gets satisfied, new desire. Don't you see suddenly, I always see suddenly a new ice cream shop is open. There is suddenly long queue, people are standing, you go there and you take ice cream, you say, really? You're all waiting for this garbage? Come on, let me give you Persian saffron ice cream. Then you understand what is ice cream, right? So the culture that always needs new discourse, something new, food, ideas, even psychotherapy, right? The new modality. For some time, I don't know if you remember, you are in the field or not, when biofeedback came, suddenly everybody was into biofeedback. It just depends what would be the state of affair on a given historical time. Again, other scholar, actually Ian Parker, is very famous in the realm of critical psychology. If you're interested, please look at his work. If you're familiar with him, even more. The last one, psychotherapy becomes crucial to the state health apparatus as a practice devoted to the balance of dissatisfaction and yearning requisite for consumption and production, right? So There are other psychologists, again, even though in minority group, who have paid attention to this, that within current form of psychotherapy, the so-called mental health crisis, as if its crisis happened in its own, cannot be addressed or cured. Now, there are some issues that I've been emphasizing, and I'm trying to kind of re-emphasize again. May I know how much more time I have? 5? 15? Oh, 15 is good. Okay, so one thing that is very interesting, is not new, has been addressed by a lot of scholars, what can be today called therapeutic culture. So Rafe wrote a book, The Triumph of Therapeutic Culture. Freud wrote Therapy Culture. Nolan wrote Total Institution. Thomas Zuss talked about psychiatrized society or psychiatrization of society. So now we are bombarded with this notion of therapeutic self. The word of healing, as Byung-Chul Han says, is a magic word of neoliberal society, right? Self-help culture is a billion-dollar industry, right? Interestingly enough, a study shows that people who engage in self-help literature develop more anxiety and depression, precisely because it's increasing the irrational expectation, is pressuring individual to change themselves, to adapt themselves. That's why Deleuze and Guattari says that the only one who can function in capitalism without becoming servant is a schizophrenic. Because a schizophrenic perpetually live in a state of egolessness. And if I'm egoless, you cannot intrigue my desire. You cannot manipulate my desire. Today, perpetually, anytime we touch our cell phone, there is an algorithm that is somehow trying to spy on us, try to engage our desire. So part of the issue today is that we are living in a therapeutic society. Society becomes psychotherapized. It can have its own place, but not as an answer to economic exploitation, not as an answer to the children of Flint, Michigan, who do not have access to sanitary water since 2014. It's not an answer to the group of native who are humiliated, tortured, and experienced genocide in their own ancestral lands and are in prison that is called reservation. It's not an answer to many other group of people who have been dislocated, prisoned, right? Humiliated, abandoned, forgotten, marginalized. So that's where I guess one area that is important. There is this cult of emotionalism that is happening a lot. Again, a lot of scholars have written and talked about it. And suddenly there is this overemphasis. Even on the language, when a student begin to talk, they say, I feel. I ask them, what do you think about this concept? He or she or they go, I feel. I said, I didn't ask for your feeling. To be precise, in this conversation, I don't even care about how you feel. Right? So also what is happening, you will see a lot of, at the time, unjustified emphasis on these feelings that needs to be addressed all the time. Sometimes it cannot take the conversation anywhere. And indeed, can become an unending conversation. You know, I have this kind of, again, certain inappropriate labels at the time I use. You know, once I had a supervising trainee. So she would throw up after a session with one specific client. So her site supervisor says, oh dear, I'm sorry, do a little bit of breathing, meditating, self-compassion. Apparently, mindfulness didn't help. She kept having severe upset stomach, at the time being nauseous and throwing up, right? So that did not help to just simply go and, have this sense of things. I said, hey, and then we talk about it, and because she did a genogram in my class, and I have to be careful about the boundary that I do not become my student therapist, right? So, and I remember a few things about her genogram, and I said, hey, you talk about this. Why haven't you addressed this? This is obviously connected, isn't it? She said, yes. I said, why don't you address this in your therapy? She says, my therapist says I'm not ready. And she has been in therapy for 5 years. I said, okay, when you are going to get ready? When this readiness is going to happen? When? How? Right? So there are again, I'm not trying to say that all therapists do that, but this is my bias and prejudice. I call it the nice Californian smiley therapist. This therapist who's so chill, always kind. How are you doing? Always look smiling and loving, but no substance, no form of critique, no form of meaningful understanding, reflection for clients. So commercialization of or commodification of psychotherapy is a big deal. We know what's going on in the field more than ever. The field become about group of gurus, one in couple therapy, one in trauma. Now here I'm using the case of trauma. Actually, with collaboration of my colleague, we wrote a book chapter on the critique of basically the children in cage, critique of trauma theory of Latina children. And this is during the first time of Trump presidency, right? That at least, during that time, at least 8 child under the age of 10 died at the custody of ICE. Now, what happened? We try to see in what way this Western trauma medical model can understand the Latina children's situation. This is not the case of common, ordinary trauma that we experience. There we utilize other theoretical concepts such as necropolitics, which was introduced by Cameroonian philosopher Achilles Mbembe as an addition to Foucault biopolitics, that Foucault says, the government try to keep certain people alive and do not care about certain group of people, right? Like it has been happening in America through our entire of, let's say, Jim Crow time, preserve whiteness, destroy, get rid of the blackness. But Achilles Mbembe says, no, Foucault did not get one part. There are a group of people whose life is not even worthy of protection. They are disposable. If they die, nobody is going to grieve for them because their life is ungrievable. When you think about, let's say, Palestinian children, there is no way that you can use this Western trauma model on them. They are necropolitical subject because they are dealing with an entirely sadist ideology that says that they must be eliminated. So I understand this so-called trauma-informed therapy is trying to help the little child. Honey, let's do a little bit of painting, color painting, how you feel, blah, blah, blah. But this is basically very dangerous because that in itself is entirely mystifying what these children are going through. Same is applicable to the situation of Latina children. And you know what is become interesting if you go back to technological rationality of Marcuse? This is based on what we studied or researched during writing our book chapter a few years ago. At that time, the data shows that this detention center, this private detention center, or at least $1.5 billion industry, right? Built based on rationality, technology, but is immensely obscene, right? Because few private owner, right? Just imagine, this group of us, let's say this whole group of us is just one individual. We have some money, we build a prison. We build a private prison, correct? Now we build a private prison, like we build a hospital. Hospital needs patient, prison needs prisoner, correct? Then it means that we have to define crime. We have to define a new version of criminality, right? So then it means that we have to define law, that based on that law we define criminality, correct? That's why majority of law in US are essential to crime. They are designed in a way that make crime possible in order for ordinary people to get in trouble. I have been told that I have 5 minutes now, I need more time. Okay, so domination of evidence-based model. Again, all of them, EFT, IFS, DBT, CBT, what they do, not that everything is wrong with them, but there is one fundamental ideological problem. They serve the dominant ideology of neoliberal capitalism, that you are responsible for your health. If you are depressed, go fix it. Go find a therapist. This is your issue. That's why today we have this obsession with healthyism. Obsessively, we are just healthy food, healthy diet, healthy this. And I'm wondering why so much of us are unhealthy. And if you look at our parents, previous generation, did not bother about eating healthy, right? Especially in this certain neighborhood of Los Angeles, right? Why the previous generation live longer? So the AI therapy, I have so much to talk about mindfulness. I'm not going to bother you. This is also another unfinished project that I have with some of my students here. So possibly you are thinking when you're going to finish it. The AI therapy and capitalism surveillance. Few years ago, I forgot her name. She wrote an interesting book called Capitalism Surveillance. Possibly you have heard some of these big digital mental health apps, such as BetterHelp. They sold client data to the bigger enterprise, right? That basically the whole idea is that, isn't that at the beginning people were saying, oh my God, whatever I talk, I see ads on my phone. Right? People thought they are dealing with some paranoia. No, basically today we are dealing, or we are under the gaze of what can be called the big digital, the digital big brother that is kind of spying on us. Now also there are a lot of challenge with this notion of one is getting engaged with the AI for sake of therapy. I'm sure there would be benefit, but there would be very serious challenge as well. So on the kind of the house psychotherapist has become depoliticized, I think a lot of critique must go toward people like me, as also as a clinician, that to what extent we are depoliticized as a subject, try to remain mute, quiet, and only perpetuate what is kind of not sensitive. There is always this question, what must be done? This has been the most annoying part of my experience as an educator, which is part of, again, American mentality on pragmatism. Americans love to do things. They cannot tolerate the ambiguity, the lack of tolerance for ambiguity, that everything must not resolve through a quick answer. Marcuse talks about negative thinking and great refusal. I hope I can talk about it later during Q&A. I guess I have only one slide or two slides left, if you don't mind. Yes. So I began with my mentor, who was with Herbert Marcuse in Germany. I guess this presentation, many things I owe him to Herbert Marcuse. So once in an interview recently, he said, those who suffer must find a solution. And those who suffer because of their thinking about their sufferings will change the world. And I think that's quite Marcusean, and that's the predicament that we have today. You come to grab the microphone?
I came to grab the microphone. Can we give it up for a speaker? before. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. All right. I think now's the time for some Q&A. If anyone has any questions, some comments, objections, go ahead. I'll come over with the mic.
So you were talking about like the concept of sublimation. So the like turning of like socially these so like turning the turning of human urges into things that are more socially acceptable. And you were talking a lot about like I guess like how an American culture media tends to sublimate a lot of the natural urges we have for freedom, for independence, for community, right? And I was wondering, with like kind of like more of the advent of like media that's specifically aimed towards like some of the more seething, like liberatory aspects of like the American like psyche, right? Things like Andor, things like Severance, right? They're trying to like pick at like the I guess like our thirsting and longing for like revolution. Do you see those these like examples of like media just like as like another example of like sublimation, or is there like some sort of like growing class consciousness that can also come from these examples that would like sometimes I even draw inspiration from?
Shuttle this over.
Now, this is getting a little bit tricky. You're asking important question, but I do not know if I am the most eligible subject to talk about this. By training, I'm a therapist, family therapist. I have some interest, so I don't want to simply act as a cultural critique or somebody who has knowledge necessarily in all of this category. But basically, you can see, for example, the whole notion of what actually the media is doing today is desublimation, right? It's dumbfounding the culture, right? Bringing human being desire to something very banal. Actually, it's a banalization of life. Now, interestingly enough, Adorno came and lived in Los Angeles, and they sold his house a few years ago, apparently. So he wrote a very interesting book called Culture Industry. And in culture industry, he used that how the mass media, the culture, create a form of anesthetization, right? Also, at the same time, they do not all dismiss all form of kind of culture, but also we have seen during certain time of 60s and 17, and even today, even right now, there are artists somewhere in this country, maybe somewhere around us, among us, they are doing something at the macro social level, but their interest is always have been at the societal level. You just, again, just when we talk about how that even hamper authentic individuality, there is so much this conversation of individualism in America. Majority of time, I think, is just a facade. Such thing doesn't exist. When millions of Americans search Kim Kardashian in 2015, apparently Kim Kardashian was the first top Google search, browse search for American. Where is this idea of uniqueness of individuality when masses follow certain form of figure? But again, one can argue that majority of the art in general is co-opted, but always there are certain form of artists, or there are certain form of, let's say psychiatrists. One of the very well co-opted group of practitioners in mental health system. But you see a lot of psychiatrists here and there among us that resist to simply being a drug dealer, basically, right? Just prescribing medication, just giving, antidepressant, there, come on, take it, and right? Without understanding that, hey, the subject has not grieved for her father. You are just prescribing fluoxetine without understanding any context. In 4 months, subject has a new problem. She gained 55 pounds. Now, previously, she was only sad and depressed. Now struggling with body image too, right?
That was short. Any other questions? Oh, right here. Come right over to you.
First off, thank you so much. Really enjoyed your talk. I'm wondering if you could revisit the pragmatics of what that looks like in the therapy room, what it looks like as a supervisor, when you teach people how to continue to politicize future therapists.
Well, if we ask Marcuse introduced two main ideas that I didn't get a chance to talk about. But that's not necessarily about psychotherapy, but rather than people in general. He introduced the idea of great refusal, that already some work and a speech has been done around it. He didn't go into detail ever to kind of show what kind of a strategy would be. But he says the very capacity that the subject use, the way of negative thinking. By negative thinking, it doesn't mean to be pessimistic or negative, rather than how, in what way the current state of affair makes sense, right? Questioning what is in front of us, questioning the current state of affair, the normalcy of things, right? Again, if I can give example of DSM, right? The progression of DSM is very interesting. From DSM-1 to DSM-5, we have at least known to me 2 psychiatrists in the house. I want to be respectful to my limitation of knowledge. Actually, they should talk about it. But what we see from 60, almost 60 category of diagnosis in DSM-1, we arrive to more than 370 diagnoses in DSM-5 edited version, right? So there remain few kind of options. One is my role as an educator, which I at least try to be authentic, at least with my students. They know my position. I have never kind of retrieved from my position. I can say there have been certain consequences. The price has not been that high. I had few issues and challenges around certain topic, a specific topic, especially if you are a brown man from Middle East, you should not talk about certain countries, certain group of people. God forbid, if you talk about Israel, it's a taboo, right? You get in trouble, you get fired, right? A lot of things can happen. But also within the realm of psychotherapy, I try to maintain in my supervision, at least in my work or from the theoretical framework that I approach is not necessarily paying attention so much to social or political issues, but the very idea of that, how kind of psychotherapy almost become a chit-chat, friendly conversation, right? It has lost its serious merit.
Any other questions that came up? Oh, right over there in the back. Let's see if this reaches.
I'll come to the microphone. Hello. Thank you for your insightful lecture. I just wanted to ask about, you're talking, reading into the work of Marcuse, who's criticizing the field of psychotherapy. Psychotherapy itself exists within the umbrella of psychology as a science. It's like the applied science of psychology. And I think you probably know better than I that it has, like, the field of psychology itself has a very specific history. And, it's Willem Wundt from the University of Leipzig who started the very first laboratory for psychological analysis. So, I think that your reference of a place like cultures like Papua New Guinea is indicative of the fact that there are other ways in which humans have met these needs historically. And I guess if you could speak to, specifically in the Western tradition, how it was that before the Industrial Revolution, before the mass production of the printing press, before academia, before all of these things, how is it that these needs were met?
So before the birth of psychology as a work of experimental science, so we have seen that society had different form of outlet to heal itself, right? Something that existed all along in all ethnic group, right? When you see civilization, ethnic group, who have a history of 8,000 years, still, interestingly enough, in current years, we are kind of even appropriating their method, right? From mindfulness and today, psychedelic assisted therapy, right? Which again, if certain group of people talk about it from those group 30, 40 years ago, in Western academia, they would have been criticized, demonized, oh, you guys want to push your drugs, this is unscientific, right? But today, apparently, it's absolutely fine in certain rich neighborhood of Los Angeles to get access to them. Now, the whole phenomenon of mental health within the tradition of sociology, anthropology is understood as a crisis of modernism, as a crisis of industrialization. Actually, one of the most important textbook in terms of methodology in social science written by Emil Durkheim on suicide, right? That Emil Durkheim discussed that suicide is not a problem of individual, it's a social phenomenon. The disintegration of community, that how community and religious group have lost power, people become isolated more in north of Europe, right? So psychotherapy in that sense become a symptom of a larger disease, an invention of remedy that in itself become problematic. However, has the capacity to become commodified, right? Can be bought, can be sold, can get expanded. Now today we have different form of retreat program. People spend unimaginable amount of money, come back, I mean, they have some fun, but they don't get out of anything because she or he was promised, come 5 days here, we are working on, let's say, how to develop self-esteem, right? In itself has a lot of kind of issues. I don't know to what extent I was able to respond to your question, but very valid point.
Yeah, and that brings us to our discussion portion. Maybe in a true Freudian sense, we can kill the speaker and turn towards each other in that way. I want to actually ask some questions first. How many of us work in mental health? Okay, cool. Got it. Then for those of us that don't work in mental health, I'd like to hear some of our experiences with systems and institutions of mental health. What has our relationships been to it?
Being actively policed by the police, like during a mental health crisis, witnessing my family members like be put in handcuffs and like taken to psychiatric hospitals and really getting more traumatized than what their original crisis like made them go through. Yeah, and generally being policed by the system.
And if you don't mind me asking, what forms of care have you found to actually help you and support you in that way?
I have found psychotherapy to be helpful, and I've also found some medication to be helpful for my mental illness. But I think more than anything, my spiritual communities and my friendships and my relationships with people who struggle with the same things I do have been the most beneficial to my healing journey.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Does anyone else have any experiences they've had with mental health institutions that they'd like to share? Or maybe ways that, oh, over there. Let's see. We'll probably have to meet halfway.
I'm a medical student, so primarily from like the healthcare system role. In the ED, I see like so many what we call code golds, which is people experiencing like mental health crisis who have to be like held down by like a group of security guards and other healthcare providers, and then given like intramuscular medication for like quote unquote agitation, and just like similarly like really harmful ways that our healthcare system can treat people who are like in acute crises. And then also just like our curriculum, our like psychiatric curriculum is quite narrowly defined as like these evidence-based methods of like CBT, DBT, and SSRIs and other medications that have been like studied, but doesn't really go beyond that.
Thank you. And I'll ask this question to the group as well, and to some of the mental health providers. But and I will raise my voice just a little bit. What are ways that you have worked within mental health in ways that integrate things like we've talked about with Marcuse, with critical theory, or just ways that we have resisted the politicizing and dehumanizing lens that mental health puts upon our clients? Just to put in short terms, how have we resisted the chains that have been put upon us? Big question, I know.
So sorry I haven't been here. I just walked by and I like this place. But when I've worked with kids and schools a lot, I've encountered a lot of kids who are parenting, and they're parenting at like 7, 8, 9, and they're making sure that their younger sibling gets, to school, and they feel like this mental load of inadequacy based on that. And I feel like our system does that, specifically in LA, because not every school has buses, but like also, the minimum wage is bullshit and blah, blah, blah. But like, that's one example.
Yeah, thank you. Can other people resonate with that? You can just nod or raise your hand. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of nods. We've seen how institutions of mental health, as we've described here, and as many of us are probably aware of, have really dehumanized and hurt the people that we love and want to care for. So I want to ask, outside of institutions, what are ways that people have found ways to show care for their peoples around them and their peers? So in other words, what are the alternative modes of care that we have been practicing and organizing around? If anyone wants to be brave.
I don't like public speaking, but I think particularly like normalizing conversations around suicidality and other mental health crises, and like ways of showing up, like mutual aid or care for people, of like just being with someone at their house while they're experiencing suicidality, and not immediately like pathologizing it or taking it to a place of like taking away their rights and autonomy.
Thank you. And I want to say something about that, is that it's about being there for people throughout the messy and the ugly and just the hard to be around, because people are hard to be around. They're the hardest thing to be around, but yet we have a responsibility to do so. And go ahead.
So first of all, thank you so much, Iman. That was brilliant. And you're right about anthropologists and ethnopsychiatry, although anthropologists suck, said the anthropologist. There are two instances in my case. One is I'm part of a black church, and when we get together, people get slain in the spirit, and they lose control, and the deacons, who are mostly women and gender-oppressed people, take care of the person who is slain in the spirit. And that's an ancient tradition that comes from West Africa, and that gets Christianized when it comes here to the U.S. And the other thing is the Yoruba tradition, of which I'm part of because of my family. We have something called a bembe, and the gods come and possess people. And you become a different gender, and people talk to the gods. So there's no sense of God over here. There's a sense of God, this person is being possessed. So one of the things I've concluded from both those experiences is there is no such thing as a self. There's only relationships in groups. And that if we can use modalities or practices that move us away from the self, and the self is a bourgeois invention, by the way. It's a Western bourgeois invention. There's no coherent universal sense of self. Then that might be a practice we can use. Those are just two instances in my case.
Yeah, thank you so much. And go ahead. I don't have anything to say.
My name is Sar. So I'm like part of the free clinic that's run out of this bookstore. And one of our newest like programs is specifically a care team that tries to integrate a lot of diversity of we're talking about like when we're doing initially the free clinic, it was primarily on like physical health and well-being, right? So we're doing things like chronic illness, we're doing things like getting people prescriptions, but we realized that there was so much of a thirst and desire and need for integration of a lot of the care that we were giving to the community outside of just taking a blood pressure or blood sugar, which of course is important, right? But there was so much other illness going around in predominantly the unhoused communities that we served, and uninsured, undocumented, underserved in general communities that we serve all around Los Angeles. So we implemented and have been integrated like a specific care team that's made up with mental health professionals, social workers, non-Western forms of like healing and body work, drawing upon a lot of the community knowledge and traditional forms of communal healing that has kind of enabled us to provide more of these services to the community, and in a lot of ways really kind of combined all the different profession skills experiences of all these different professions, right, which all have been atomized, are also as the clients or as the patients themselves are atomized, the professionals themselves are indeed also atomized from one another, hyper-specialized, and then separated from one another. So the care team, the free clinic kind of combines a lot of different, and in a lot of different ways, keep bringing all of us together into the same room, into the same space, specifically, especially through our distro clinic, as a means of providing holistic care, from the head to the toe, from the mind to the body, from the social to the spiritual, right, and providing all these services and combining them in one space so that when a person comes in, they get all their needs met, and also when the professionals come in, right, from their own specific specialty, they then kind of go across their profession to learn how might I take care of someone's physical well-being by taking care of their mental well-being, by taking care of the fact that they need to have good healthy food to eat, right, and all of that kind of combines us all together. Bing, bang, boom. Sorry, did you want to say something? Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add some more? Yeah. Hi there. I just wanted to add some more. About the care team operation, I think it's also important to bring levity into the work too, because as I opened up saying that mental health professionals and social workers have directly participated in so much harm, like eugenics, for instance, when it comes to racism science, all of those things, name it, taking away children from indigenous communities and replacing it, rehoming folks, and coming from a very charity model. And I think that a lot of us here are operating from a sense that we would like to not drink the Kool-Aid. I think that it's important to recognize the harms that it has perpetuated, and also understanding that this is a very, very limited model, and also that we are part of the whole system. And I think the care team has rose as a result of all those thoughts that we are having. But in order to, I think a lot of us are trying to make our jobs obsolete, because they should not exist the way that it does at this current form. Whether it's therapists, it should not be it's really reinforcing that sense of alienation, placing folks into isolated rooms, and that individual therapy can be very corrosive in many ways. And if we just do have that collective care, right? If we can turn to our communities, our neighbors, we really don't have to place all that responsibility to just one individual who has that positive power over you. So some things that when I go back to the levity part, some things that we are doing in our programming is of course building resumes together, or hey, did you get a random letter from EBT? Come bring it, let's read it together and see what's up with that, and let's send it back. And but also, how an In-N-Out has a secret menu? We also need that so hard. So under our secret menu that is not widely advertised, there's a bunch of things that happened. One thing is we have trapped and neutered a cat for an unhoused like community member. Brought me so much joy. That was like so fun. Another one that we did was there was a lawyer who reached out, immigration lawyer who reached out to us saying that they're personally supporting this one person who, if we can just draft basically like a letter that is like listing their medical necessity, they might be able to advocate for this person to be out of that, ICE unit. So that's something that like the medics over here and our doctors have like put together, which was amazing. So I think those are just something creative ways that we're trying to bypass the system where possible. But also like I think that we want to be not on the defense because like that is, like we can't always be in a defense. So how can we actually be on the offense is a question that I want to like open it up to this room. And we're not closing it out just yet, but I do want to, like, since there's so many mental health professionals here or like folks who are involved in community care in different forms, please do come find us and like talk to us afterwards so we can like collaborate more in some tangible forms. And I think Nicole over here also is someone who has more information to a brick and mortar free clinic that will be operating in historic Filipino town. So I think that we can discuss that later on if you are also interested in plugging in. So.
Thank you, T. I realize that it's probably pretty hot and we're all getting a little tired. But I do want to ask one more question is like, what can care look like outside of mental health? And I think that's something that T and the rest of the clinic has really stressed is that sometimes care doesn't look like sitting with someone right in front of you in a therapy room. Sometimes it's just helping them get groceries, helping them fill out an EBT letter, helping them look at their resume. So I don't think people have the energy right now to discuss in front of a mic, but I would urge you guys to discuss amongst each other to figure out ways that we can care for each other and resist the atomization that we undergo as mental health professionals and those that are under the gaze of the mental health eye. So yeah. If we have any words to close us out, then thank you all for coming. And thank you, Iman.
And mingle. Yeah, come talk to us if you want to hear more. Yes, and also if you're able, if you don't mind like folding your chairs and like bringing over there by the door that says restroom, that will be immensely helpful so we can put them away. But we're going to stay open for longer. So if you want to look at merch or just like come chat, chop it up, get to meet other folks, like please feel welcome to do so. Thank you so much for being here in this heat wave. I know it's been grueling hot, but so many appreciation.